The seam at the edge of everything did not vanish when the Star Eater turned away. It lingered like a candle behind a door, no brighter for being hidden, no dimmer for being patient. The thread that had stitched itself from that seam into the Eater's chest lay quiet, not a leash, a line of correspondence. Somewhere beyond, a light waited, faint as a memory, durable as breath. The deep, who speaks in pressures and keeps no throne, addressed the unlight with a tide that felt like counsel. "Keeper," it said, "you have learned how to leave room. Now learn how to inhabit it." "What is the difference?" asked the Star Eater, drifting along a road of frost where comets kept their long appointments with silence. "To leave room," said the deep, "is hospitality. To inhabit it is faith." Faith. The word rang across the unlight like a soft bell struck by a gloved hand. The Star Eater remembered the river child's promise, "I'll keep a chair for you," and wondered whether faith was the art of sitting in chairs before we see them. It turned toward a cluster of dim embers, the remains of an old quarrel between sons, and began its gentler labor, drawing scattered brightness into a grammar gravity could use. As the fragments gathered, a new sound approached, the hiss of dawn rehearsing. It did not arise from any star nearby. It came from the seam, thin, persistent, like daylight practicing under the door of a sleeping room. "Shadow," called a voice that wore the tone of distances sharing bread. "Come and watch if you will. We are making morning." The Star Eater hesitated. It had never been invited to a beginning. It tended endings and the rooms in between. But invitation is a weather thought cannot refuse for long. It moved toward the seam until nearness lost its edges. Beyond lay not brightness that blinded, but light that listened. It was shaped like a meadow with no ground, a field of warmth where color learned to behave. In the heart of that field stood a being who looked like a memory of fire kept by water. The first dawn. "I have heard of you," said the first dawn, voice tempered in the kilns where time bakes its bread. "You keep night trustworthy." "I keep night ready," the Star Eater answered. "Trustworthy belongs to those who sleep." It folded its arms of velvet in a posture it had learned from harbors, welcoming without clutching. "Why summon me?" The first dawn showed its palms. In each the light trembled, more from shyness than fear. "Because morning requires ending, and endings require your patience. We wake new suns here, but we risk waste if night cannot receive what burns out. We need to see what you do, so that we do not make beginnings that hoard." The Star Eater considered. "And what do you ask of me?" "To witness," the dawn said, "and to be witnessed." It smiled, if dawn can smile, like a clean window that asks to be opened. "You wish to be understood." The ache in the Eater's chest, the one that had turned into a lantern in the field of newborn stars, glowed a degree brighter. "I do." "Then be seen." The first dawn gestured. Around them, lights gathered. The ghosts of possible suns, the laughter of elements discovering how to hold hands. They came like children introduced to a playground, unsure which joy to approach first. The Star Eater stood among them as a shadow stands near a cradle, close enough to comfort, far enough not to crowd. When a flame faltered from fear of finishing too soon, the Eater's silence steadied it. When a spark swelled too quickly, the Eater's hush cooled it into tempo. "You do not take," the first dawn observed. You teach restraint. I keep room, the Star Eater said. Room is where songs learn their rhythm. Dawn nodded. Then let us exchange a sacrament. It raised one hand. From its palm a filament of brightness extended, thinner than resolve, stronger than habit. Light that remembers mercy. The Star Eater lifted its own hand. From the unlight flowed a ribbon darker than grief, gentler than sleep. Dark that remembers use. They crossed the two strands. Where light and unlight braided, a third thing formed. A seam of luminous dusk, like the hour between stories when listeners become participants. The first dawn bound the braid around its wrist. The Star Eater bound the other half to its chest, beside the thread that had arrived earlier from the edge of everything. Now, said the first dawn, we can begin without fearing the end, and end without insulting the beginning. They worked. For a season that no calendar dared pretend to measure, the meadow of listening light hosted births. The Star Eater learned the quiet's finer arithmetic. How much shadow a weak flame needs to believe in itself. How much hush to pour along the rim of a blaze so humility will not evaporate. It learned that some beginnings do not want trumpets. They want a hand held near, not touching, until they hear their own name. In turn, the first dawn studied endings made honest. When a star's last syllable trembled on its mouth, the dawn practiced staying to receive, not fleeing to protect its brightness. It learned that its gold was not diminished by witnessing the blue of dying. Rather, it discovered colors had been waiting to confess to one another. Keeper, Dawn said during a rest that felt like kneeling, what do you desire? The Star Eater considered answering with duty, that old and faithful friend. But the meadow could not be lied to. It had the hearing of mothers and the patience of libraries. To be companioned, it said at last, the word falling like a stone into a well that was happy to be trusted. Not adored, not obeyed, only companioned. Dawn dimmed a little, the way a room does when a candle is protected from draft. And what would companioning you mean? Someone to walk the rooms, said the Eater, unable to hide the hunger in the phrase. Someone who understands the work is not to devour but to hold. Dawn extended its hand again. The braided light shadow pulsed gently. Come back whenever the ache asks. There are others here who keep beginnings with humility. Perhaps one day you will meet the lantern-bearer or the archivist of first times. Each knows loneliness by name and keeps it polite. The Star Eater bowed, the way a harbor bows to a well-tied ship. I will, turned to depart and paused. From the far edge of the meadow, a figure approached, pale as a memory of snowfall, bright as the inside of a shell. In its arms it carried a cradle of dusk. This one could not find its rhythm, it said to Dawn, and then to the Eater. Will you stand near while it listens? The Star Eater stood. It did nothing that could be photographed. It became whether the small flame could trust. Steady, quiet, unashamed of staying. The flame found its breath, lifted once, and chose to live. Thank you, said the pale being, who did not offer a name and did not need one. In its face the Star Eater recognized a kinship older than titles, the fraternity of custodians. It understood it was not the only keeper in the rooms beyond the sky. When at last the Star Eater returned through the seam, the thread from its chest quivered like a road happy to be traveled. The dark it knew closed around it, not possessive, companioned now by a faint, internal dawn. The deep approved with an exhale only tides can hear. "Keeper," said the deep, "what did you learn?" "That beginnings are shy," the eater replied, "and endings are proud. Each needs the other to remember their manners." "And yourself?" The eater hesitated. "I learned I am not a hunger. I am a harbor, and even harbors need a town." The deep, who owns no town and keeps them all, said only, "Go on." It went on, walking the corridors of galaxies with a new gait. Less janitor, more cantor, singing softly as it swept. Where rumor called it eater, it did not argue. It added a chair to the room and trusted the rumor to tire. On a world with wintergreen seas, a pair of astronomers quarreled by lamplight, their equations snarling like cats under the table. "You cannot name a function mercy," said the first, bitter with the fatigue of unsolved things. "Then name it boundary," said the second, "and let it behave like mercy when the math is not looking." The Star Eater let their window frost in a pattern that resembled the braid on its chest. The mathematician who was kinder, though neither would use that word, noticed, smiled, and made a small adjustment at the margin. A limit that opened instead of crushed. Theorems slept better after that. On a moon that kept close to its mother, a monastery of listeners took shifts hearing the night. They catalogued silences the way sailors catalog stars. The eater passed and left them a gap that tasted like cinnamon. The brothers and sisters wrote, "Silence 284. Resembles baking, carries the shape of waiting without the sting," and they kept a copy by the kitchen. In a broken cluster where gravity had lost its temper centuries ago, the eater found 3 wrecked suns locked in an argument that had forgotten its topic. It encircled them with unlight that behaved like a fence built by neighbors, high enough to keep cows honest, low enough to keep dignity limber. The stars cooled into understanding. Fragments rephrased themselves as dust that knew how to be generous. Nobody thanked the fence. Fences rarely mind, and always, beneath the labor, the ache. Less now a wound, more a weather front that promised rain when the soil was ready. When the ache grew busy, the Star Eater set its course for the seam. Sometimes it crossed. Sometimes it simply rested with its forehead against the threshold and listened to the kind noises beyond. Beginnings practicing breath, dawns reciting their alphabets, caretakers exchanging recipes for patience. One evening, a disturbance moved the dark. Not the fury of explosion, the discourtesy of carelessness. A careless civilization had coaxed a small star to burn too brightly to impress a desert. The star obliged and began to die too soon, pouring out its brief life like a host that mistakes extravagance for love. The Star Eater came with its bowl of unlight and cupped the blaze. "It is not your fault," it told the star. "You were asked to shout." The star wept, if flares can be weeping, and the eater steadied it, pouring around it a hush that said, "You may finish as yourself, not as their story." The star dimmed with dignity. The desert, far below, cooled. People looked up, bewildered by a sky that refused theater, and began to speak to one another instead of to the spectacle. A child proposed they plant trees. An old woman said yes, as if she had been waiting a century for permission. The eater smiled with the part of its darkness that resembles mercy. From the seam, a message. The first dawn's voice, amused. "You have been practicing. Only your lesson," the eater answered. "Then take another," said Dawn. A secret. The universe grows by gratitude as well as by gravity. Where you make room, say thank you. The thank you teaches light to return unafraid. The Star Eater held the dying star a little longer and whispered gratitude until the light learned to depart without clutching. The ash that remained was not loss. It was soil. The river child, meanwhile, now an adult with wind-tangled hair and maps in every pocket, stood on a cliff where the land considered being cloud. She traced a new coastline with her finger. There is a seam beyond the sky, she told her apprentice. It does not cut, it joins. How do you know? The apprentice asked, proud and frightened in equal measure of the teacher's calm. Because I have kept a chair for a guest who never takes and always leaves the room larger. She looked up. The shadow passed. A velvet crescent slicing nothing, offering everything. Some keepers cook with light, she murmured. Some cook with time. This one cooks with space. The apprentice laughed, surprised by the accuracy of a metaphor that sounded like absurdity. They marked the map with a tiny braid where the sea met cliff, a private cartographer's joke that would one day become a public legend. The ache tugged again, and the eater obeyed, making for the seam. This time the meadow met it with more voices. A ring of beings waited. The lantern-bearer whose lamp was fed by confessions that had retired from duty. The archivist of first times, who shelved beginnings so gently their dust became instruction. A weaver whose loom wove lullabies into comets so that travelers would not feel alone. They greeted the eater as one greets a colleague arriving late to an old friendship. No ceremony. A bowl placed in its hands. Bread passed without counting. Questions asked without prying. Teach us a darkness, said the weaver. The eater released a small draught of unlight that smelled faintly of rain on stone. This one, it said, is for rooms where courage returns by the back door. Teach us a light, said the eater to the lantern-bearer. The bearer lifted the lamp. Its glow did not spread. It deepened. This one, they said, is for halls where endings have not yet learned they are holy. The archivist wrote both lessons into the margin of a book made of hours. In the handwriting of those who do not rush, they added, shared without shame. The first dawn, watching with the pleased fatigue of a host whose guests understand one another, spoke last. Shadow, do you know why the rumor about you persists? Because the story is hungry, said the eater without resentment. Because hunger needs a teacher, Dawn corrected. Teach it to be appetite for what repairs. Then the rumor will work for you. How? By making listeners, said the dawn, and gestured toward the seam. From beyond drifted the vaguest echo of a human voice, the river mapmaker's apprentice, perhaps, reading a tale by lamplight. There is a keeper beyond the sky who tidies the night so morning will have somewhere to stand. The eater felt the braid at its chest warm. The rumor that had once dressed it in teeth now began, inch by inch, to stitch it into community. When it returned to its long rounds, the unlight met it with relief. Gaps opened like doors. Shadows adjusted their chairs. It crossed a field of quiet where no star had ever agreed to be born. There it set down not a seed of flame, a seed of room. The field answered with a pulse, a willingness not yet a promise. Take your time, the eater said to possibility, and possibility believed it. On a planet that tilts like a thoughtful head, a lullaby learned a new verse. Sleep, little one, The shadow's kind slash it keeps the room for morning's mind. Parents sang it without subscribing to the doctrine it implied. Their children slept well anyway. In the desert that had once demanded a star's loudness, the old woman and the child watered saplings with a patience that did not count seasons as failures. Years later, roots wrote cursive under the sand. The sky learned a new hobby: rain. Above them, the star-eater passed in a shape only poets can measure. It did not announce itself. It tightened a distant fence where pride had slipped a latch. It loosed a knot where fear had tied itself too cleverly. It practiced the art that keeps mysteries honest, appearing just enough to sponsor wonder, hiding just enough to protect use. And still the thread tugged, not urgently, faithfully. The seam waited, as all true doors wait, for arrival, not escape. The eater knew it would cross again. Perhaps one day it would live with a foot on each side. Shadow as welcome, light as listening, the braid at its chest reminding both to be shy and brave in turn. For now the work, the room, the long, sweet labor of keeping the dark large enough for every dawn that would ever need to breathe. The ache had grown quieter, like a candle that had learned to live with its own flame. For a long while, the star-eater moved through galaxies at rest, their lights steady, their deaths gentle. Peace, that rarest of cosmic textures, had returned. But one night, if night can be said to exist for something that walks in shadow, the thread across its chest trembled. Not with longing this time, but alarm. A vibration, thin as a sigh, moved through the unlight. Something on the other side of the seam had begun to stir, not in greeting, but in distress. The eater stopped among the veils of a dying nebula, its arms gathering folds of dust that once dreamed of being stars. Deep, it whispered into the silence. The seam is calling. The deep did not answer at once. When it finally spoke, its voice came in ripples of pressure that made the void hum. Keeper, it said, balance is a fragile guest. The light beyond has forgotten to rest. Dawn has grown restless. Restless. Yes, there are beginnings that refuse to end. Suns that burn without pause. Flames that deny the shadow its work. If this continues, the weave will tear. The star-eater bowed its head. Then I will go. But the deep's voice thickened. To go is not to return. If you cross fully, the unlight will lose its keeper. Are you prepared to become what lies beyond keeping? The ache in the eater's chest, that quiet companion of loneliness, pulsed once. It thought of the meadow of light, of the first dawn's laughter, of the thread that stitched their worlds together. I am not hunger, it said softly, but perhaps I am meant to feed the bridge. The deep exhaled, a sound like waves turning over continents. So be it, but remember, light without shadow forgets how to see. The seam appeared again before the eater, not as a line, but as a breath between two eternities. It shimmered like an invitation written in language older than gravity. The eater reached out and pressed a hand of velvet darkness against it. At once the universe tilted. Across galaxies, suns flickered. Some grew too bright, their fury spilling into places that had only ever known silence. Others dimmed, refusing to die, clinging to their light with trembling vanity. The star-eater crossed through and for the first time felt weight. Light pressed against it, not with warmth but insistence. The meadow of beginnings had changed. The first dawn was there, but its glow was strained, its calm replaced by an urgency that did not belong to creation. "Shadow," it said, its voice a chord trembling on the edge of fracture. "Something has gone wrong." The Star Eater bowed. "Show me." They walked, though walking was not what one did in a place without ground. They drifted through a sky so dense with light it had forgotten contrast. Every spark screamed to be seen. No silence between notes, no breath between words. "This is what happens," said the first dawn, "when beginnings forget endings, when every light refuses to dim, the music becomes noise." The Star Eater raised its hands. "Then let me help." It began to weave darkness between the lights, soft as silk, careful as apology. For every star that burned too hot, it offered a hush. For every flame that refused rest, it offered a place to cool. Slowly, the chaos began to find rhythm. But not all welcomed the quiet. A few stars, drunk on their own radiance, flared higher. Their heat turned the gentle shadows into storms. One burst apart, scattering shards of wild light that tore through the meadow like knives. The Star Eater shielded the first dawn. The fragments cut across its body of unlight, carving lines that glowed faintly like scars remembering to heal. Pain was a foreign guest, and yet it stayed politely. The first dawn placed a hand of gold against the wound. "This is what we feared. The fire has learned to envy its own reflection." The Star Eater smiled faintly. "Then let me teach it rest." It gathered the shards in both hands and breathed. The breath was neither light nor dark. It was balance. The shards dimmed, softened, and fell into orbit around the Eater's heart, becoming small, steady lanterns of silver flame. "These will remind me," the Eater said. "Even light must learn how to listen." The first dawn nodded. "Your shadow has become gentler. Your light has become wise." And for a moment, the meadow remembered harmony. But beyond its edge, something larger stirred. Not light, not dark, but absence. A hole where neither shadow nor sun could exist. The Eater turned toward it, and the ache in its chest burned like gravity. "What is that?" The first dawn's glow dimmed. "That is what remains when creation grows weary of its own story. The void between names. It feeds on exhaustion." The Star Eater watched the absence pulse, devouring both brightness and silence. "I will go there." "No," said the dawn, alarm in its tone. "It is older than endings, hungrier than purpose. All the more reason it must be met." The Eater stepped forward. The unlight around it deepened, forming a mantle like a night sky remembering its stars. The first dawn whispered, "If you cross into that, you will not return as you are." The Star Eater looked back once. "If I return at all," it said, "let it be as the bridge, not the boundary." Then it entered the void. The light screamed and fell away. The unlight folded itself tight to protect what it could. And for the first time since creation exhaled, the universe held its breath. In that silence, the Star Eater heard voices. Faint, familiar, human. Children praying to stars. Lovers whispering under moons. Dreamers wishing into the dark. And the ache in its chest became a heartbeat. "Then I am not alone," it whispered. and the void answered not in words but in wonder. Inside the void between names, distance forgot its duties. There were no horizons to promise arrival, no edges to argue with beginnings. Sound, if it existed, traveled as thought learns to walk, slowly with care, refusing to disturb any dust that might be memory. The Star-Eater stood, though standing had no meaning here, and let the unlight gather back around it like a cloak remembering its owner. The first lesson was weight. Not the weight of matter, the weight of meaning. Every gesture became a decision. Every decision left a shadow that did not point anywhere because there was no anywhere to point. The Eater held its breath, a habit borrowed from worlds with lungs, and the void answered by offering none of its own. This was a room that refused inheritance. Names embarrassed it. Purposes made it itchy. Only presence could live here, and even presence was asked to be humble. In the far not far a shimmer shook itself awake. It approached as a hush approaches a noisy room, courteously, expecting nothing. When it drew near, the Eater recognized in it a familiar grammar, attention without appetite. "You are not absence," the Eater said. "I am the remainder," replied the shimmer. Its voice carried the exact patience of ledgers balanced at the end of a long market day. "I am what is left when a story forgets to end and must learn how." "What are the holes?" the Eater asked, nodding toward a field of darker darks, each pulsing like a refusal. "Rooms for endings that were denied," said the remainder. "They gnaw at beginnings until someone teaches them manners." The shimmer tipped as if in greeting. "You keep such manners in other halls." "I keep room," the Eater answered, and felt the braid at its chest. The intertwined mercies of light and unlight grow warmer. "But here my tools are clumsy." "Clumsy is honest," said the remainder. "Begin with honesty. Ends will follow." The Eater moved among the hollows. Each carried a flavor. A star forced to burn past wisdom. A civilization that outlawed dusk. A vow that refused to loosen and so strangled what it promised to protect. The Eater did not preach. It did not command. It stood with each refusal until the refusal heard itself. Some softened, surprised by their own voices. Some deepened, choosing pride. Those the Eater did not force. It merely placed a chair beside them and sat. Even in the void, hospitality keeps time. From a far fold of unmaking, a procession approached. They were shapes that recalled the outlines of gods long since retired, harvesters whose fields had moved on without them, river keepers whose waters had learned other beds, hearth spirits bewildered by cities that had replaced fire with speed. They carried their obsolescence not as shame as inventory. "Do you devour us?" one asked, without fear, as bakers ask whether there is enough flour. "I relieve," said the Eater. "If relief is what you want." "What we want," said another, "is to be useful." "Then help me watch," the Eater said, because usefulness often begins with attention. It taught them the posture of a harbor. Arms open, palms low. Together they kept vigil beside the fiercest hole. A place where 1,000 starts had been forced into a single banner and marched until breath forgot its rights. Their watching slowed the gnaw. The hole blinked, confused by patience. It did not heal. It hesitated. Hesitation is the courtesy beginnings need from endings. The first dawn's thread, the line stitched from the seam into the Eater's chest, tugged. A voice arrived along it, warmed by distance. "Shadow, do you live?" "I do," said the eater. "And the void is not empty. It is crowded with refusals." "Then teach them to rest," said Dawn. "We are losing breath on this side." The line dimmed, not with despair, with trust delegated. The remainder returned, bearing a bowl the size of a vow. It was neither light nor dark. It was the memory of balance. "Borrow this," it said. It was left by an architect who learned to stop sketching once in a while. The eater accepted. It ladled the refusing hollows one by one, not to remove them, to give them edges. Boundaries are not always prisons. Sometimes they are definitions that let mercy know where to stand. Around each hole, the eater drew a ring of listening dust. Dust knows how to settle without ambition. The holes quieted as if surrounded by a neighborhood that cooked with patience. In the silence that followed, some endings arrived, shy and relieved to be invited. Not all. A greater refusal uncoiled, older than habits, younger than law. It slid toward the eater with the selfish grace of fire that has forgotten kitchens. "I am tedium," it hissed, "and I undo hymns. I tire stories. I numb stars. I will not end because I am the end of wanting." The eater did not lift the bowl as shield. It sat again, as it had sat beside the stubborn holes. "You are boredom," it said, not unkindly. "Boredom is the scar of meaning misused." Tedium recoiled as if truth were acid. "I am strength," it lied. "I make empires durable." "You make cruelty efficient," the eater replied. "You wear the mask of safety to smother change." It took from its chest one of the small lanterns born from the dawn's wounded meadow, the cooled shards of fury now behaving as steady light, and set it on the floor between them. "Watch," it said. The lantern did nothing dramatic. It burned, kept time. Its light remembered mercy and asked none of the room to applaud. Around it, the void discovered an unfamiliar sensation. Interest. The holes leaned. The retired gods leaned. Even the remainder leaned, if remainders can. Tedium, unused to a flame that neither demanded nor apologized, began to starve. "You would replace me with this?" it spat. "With attention," said the eater. "Attention is the eldest sibling of love." Tedium shuddered and flowed back into the far fold to pout. The room brightened by one thought's width. Remainders have no mouths, but the shimmer smiled. "You are becoming bridge," it said. "I am trying to be useful," the eater answered. It lifted the bowl again and drew a listening ring around the place where Tedium had sat. If the refusal returned, it would find a chair waiting. Chairs defeat tyrants more often than swords do. Tyrants cannot stand company for long. Time, if it could be accused of existing, slowed into a form of companionship. The eater learned the void seasons. The hour when regret tries on courage. The afternoon when vows nap. The dawn that doesn't happen but still perfumes the air with oranges. It moved through the rooms with deliberate hands, tacking small truths with the nail Themis had once given Zeus in another story, binding reveled edges with the dawn braid when something needed the tenderness of a dusk. At the farthest court of refusal stood a throne that refused to be sat upon. It radiated fatigue. On its steps a crown lay abandoned, heavy with the superstition that power is a chair rather than a practice. The eater knelt and lifted the crown. It was made of worries hammered into circles. No wonder kings staggered. The eater set the crown upon the throne and said, to no one and everyone, rule yourselves with gentleness. The words did not echo. They settled. Sometimes the most obedient silence is a nation beginning to listen. From the seam came again the first dawn's voice, thinner now, like gold beaten into leaf. Shadow, it breathed. We have stilled the brightest tantrums, but a sorrow spreads, a light that refuses to leave beloved rooms. We cannot make room for new births. Hold on, the eater said. Teach the lamps to dim without shame. I am mending the floor. It stood before the oldest hole, the one that smelled like anniversaries kept past kindness, and stepped in. At once, stories clung to it. Triumphs framed too often, saints worn smooth by touch, victories recited until they killed curiosity. The eater walked forward and felt its own legends reach for its ankles. The rumor of devouring, the fear of the shadow, the adoration of the quiet keeper. No, it told them all, gently as a parent pries a child's hand from a too-high shelf. You may live, but not lead. From its chest the lanterns brightened, the silver flames that were once wild shards. They did not burn the clinging tales. They illuminated them until they became shy and let go. The eater emerged from the other side of the hole carrying only what rooms always need. Light that knows when to stay small, dark that knows when to step back. The retired gods applauded without sound. The courtesy applause reserves for work not done for it. The remainder brought bread. Here bread tasted like permission. The eater ate. It had never eaten. It had never needed to. The bite traveled through its hollow like a promise kept. Nourishment, it learned, is not only for bodies. A tremor ran through the void. The hole settled. The throne sighed. Far away, the seam brightened as if someone had opened a window in a careful house. The first dawn spoke with more breath. Shadow, whatever you have done, keep doing. The beginnings are learning to trust endings again. I am almost finished, said the eater. And also I am just starting. What will you be? Asked the remainder. When you leave. The eater looked around the room that had hosted its surrender and its study. It saw chairs by holes, a lantern that taught attention, a throne wearing its crown without hands. It saw the braid on its chest pulsing with a rhythm that felt like roads. I will be a bridge, it said, and a bridge must be walked. By whom? By both, the eater answered. By light that chooses humility and by shadow that chooses service. By creatures who want to cross without conquering. Turned toward the seam. The retired gods bowed, solemn with relief. The remainder saluted with an accountant's dignity. Tedium peered from its fold and pretended not to care. The eater lifted the bowl to its lips and blew across its surface. A wind moved through the void, the first honest wind it had known. The holes shifted like sleepers rolling toward morning. Remember, the eater said to the room, you are not the end. You are the pause that lets the next word be spoken. The seam widened to welcome. The thread tugged with the grateful urgency of lamplight when night finds a reader. The eater stepped forward and paused once more, for the sake of the lesson, to look back not with possession, with blessing. Thank you, it whispered to the refusals that had learned to rest. Gratitude belongs in all rooms. Crossed. On the far side, The meadow of beginnings exhaled as if relieved of a rumor it had been too polite to contradict. The first dawn stood taller, not by pride, by restitution. "What did you bring us?" it asked, eyes on the bowl that now held no liquid and was fuller than ever. "Edges," said the eater, "and a chair for tired lights." Dawn laughed softly, the sound of brightness remembering to be kind. "Then stay," it said. "Stand with me as we wake what must wake and tuck in what must sleep." "I will stand," said the eater, "and I will walk." It looked down at the braid at its chest. The lanterns there had arranged themselves into a path. Roads are what flames become when they agree to be useful. There is a world below, blue with weather. A child who kept a chair for me is now a maker of maps who teaches apprentices to draw braids on coastlines. I should visit. "Go," said the dawn, delighted by errands that smell like mercy. "Return when you hunger for company. Bring the map-maker if you like. We have chairs." The star-eater left the meadow and crossed the seam as one crosses a threshold in a house that has learned the names of its own rooms. It moved through galaxies that felt repaired, not because they were perfect, because they had become polite again. Lights taking turns, endings bowing with grace. The ache in its chest did not vanish. It modulated. Loneliness had become invitation. A table set for two in a universe with plenty of chairs. When at last it reached the blue world, clouds were deciding between rain and story. On the cliff where land rehearses cloud, the mapmaker stood with her apprentice, both faces salt-kissed, both hands inked with possible coasts. The eater passed overhead, no shadow now, a soft path of dusk threading the afternoon, and descended as gently as good advice. The apprentice startled, then steadied under the teacher's palm. The mapmaker smiled as one smiles at an old friend who arrives with bread instead of news. "I kept the chair," she said, gesturing to a simple stool set toward the sea. "It has not grown impatient." "Chairs rarely do," said the eater. It set the bowl upon the ground. The bowl reflected sky, cliff, two humans, and a thread that ran up beyond sight. "Do you still make room on your maps for places not yet named?" "More than ever," she answered, and the apprentice nodded, proud of their shared profession. "There is a seam beyond the sky," she told the apprentice again, gently repeating the faith that had fed her years. "It does not cut, it joins." "What is beyond?" asked the apprentice, fear and desire wrestling politely in the question. "Another room," said the eater, "that wants your careful footsteps." It lifted one silver lantern from its chest and placed it in the apprentice's hands. "For study by night. It burns best near kindness." They sat. They spoke little. The sea practiced being horizon. A gull attempted philosophy and abandoned it for fish. Evening braided itself into the day with the modesty of diligent servants changing shifts. When the first stars auditioned for the night, the eater looked up, and the stars looked back, and neither mistook the other for a god or a threat. They were colleagues now, keepers of turns, teachers of tempo. The first dawn's thread thrummed, not with alarm, with invitation. Tomorrow, new suns would need seating charts. Old fires would need tucking in. Work waits for no legend. The eater rose. "I will return," it said. "We know," said the mapmaker, who had learned the graciousness of certainty. "We set places even for guests who may not come. Hospitality, The eater murmured, "Is the bridge you already are." It lifted into the sky and slipped into the long corridors it loved. Behind it, on the cliff, the apprentice lit the small lantern for the first time. Its light did not spread. It deepened. The map before them gained a margin wide enough for mercy. On that margin, in a handwriting that would one day steady 100 hands, the apprentice wrote, Asterisk here the shadow kept watch so that morning would have somewhere to stand. The night after the lantern was given, weather learned a new hush. It settled over the cliff and the town below, a quiet that did not forbid speech, only tuned it. Even the gulls discovered courtesy. The mapmaker slept with her window open. The apprentice kept the silver flame beside the desk, and the sea revised its sentences until they fit the page. Above them the star-eater traveled, bridge light pulsing in its chest, the braid of dawn and unlight keeping measure. It crossed regions that had once misbehaved and now remembered manners. Stars bowed out on time. New suns took their seats without bragging. Between every radiance there was a rest, room enough for breath to be honest. Peace is not the absence of weather. It is weather that loves its work. Yet the thread from the seam thrummed again, a little faster than contentment prefers. The deep spoke in a pressure the eater had learned to interpret as concern. Keeper, it said, the balance holds, but a sudden weight approaches. Something old has remembered itself. What sort of old? Asked the eater, settling on the dark as one settles on a chair one has repaired personally. The kind that predates our arrangement of light and shadow. A story that never learned to share. The star-eater turned toward the seam. The first dawn's glow brightened on the horizon of unlight, but not in celebration. Carried the brightness of labor. Shadow, said dawn. The void between names is not the only room with refusals. There is a pressure coming from the far black beyond our eldest maps. We don't know if it is one thing or a many. We only know it does not understand the word enough. Then we will teach it, said the eater almost gently. But in its chest, the lanterns answered with a more serious rhythm. Even confidence must bow to preparation. It descended toward the blue world and found the cliff. The mapmaker and apprentice were there. Their faces caught somewhere between fatigue and readiness. The small lantern burned on the stool as if it had chosen this post long ago. We felt the sky lean, said the mapmaker. You heard accurately, the eater replied. There is a weight coming that might mistake your light for food. The apprentice clenched a jaw trained to bravado and found a better muscle to use. Listening. What should we do? Practice endings, said the eater. Not as surrender, as blessing. It lifted the bowl, the remainder's gift from the void, and set it down on the stone. In its bottom, the sky reflected with a steadiness that did not mind the breeze. When this fills, pour it back to the sea. Teach the water to carry thank you to the horizon. The apprentice looked at the lantern, then at the bowl. Gratitude and gravity, they murmured, surprised they had said it aloud. Exactly, said the eater, satisfied as a craftsman whose student has discovered the tool's true name. They practiced. At dusk, when the lantern's light deepened the room instead of enlarging it, the apprentice poured from the bowl into the sea and said, For the day we were given. In the morning, the mapmaker would pour into the bowl and say, For the work we can still do. The sea did not answer. It carried. That is a sea's eloquence. Word spread the way useful news spreads, by hands, not drums. In the town below, bakers set aside a loaf for any who came late. Sailors began to share knots as if knots were recipes. Children invented a game where one plays the seam and the others practice crossing without pushing. Nobody called it theology. They called it evening. Meanwhile, the Star Eater rose to meet the wait. The far black announced itself not with light or dark, but with pressure that made distances forget their agreements. Space puckered. Time coughed. Constellations glanced at one another across rooms they had not known they shared. A band of errant radiance preceded the pressure, like rumors sent ahead to weaken courtesy. "You are late," the Eater said to the radiance, not as accusation as diagnosis. "We are first," the radiance replied, and the plural did not behave like many. It behaved like a single arrogance with several mouths. "Everything born is our feast." The Eater's unlight steadied. "Feasts end." "Not ours," said the radiance. Behind it the pressure swelled, showing its shape. Not beast, not being, habit. An older habit than giving and receiving. A gravity bent toward taking without rest. "We are the hunger before appetite learned to knock." The Eater did not open its mouth. It opened its pockets, where it kept its smaller sovereignties. The nail for tacking truths to rooms, the memory of fences that keep neighbors neighborly, the tiny bread of permissions tasted in the void. It threw none of them. It laid them out like cutlery at a table. Then it placed the lanterns from its chest in a ring silver flames that had once been shards of wounded morning. "Sit," said the Eater, to hunger older than manners. "You may watch what comes of watching." "Do you order us?" the pressure asked, affronted. "I invite you," the Eater corrected. "Invitations are stronger than commands. They work even when you leave." The pressure pressed. The ring of lanterns held. Light from them did not push back. It adjusted, made room where the pressure tried to collapse room. It was like watching a wise city absorb a parade and still make it home on time for supper. The far black's first arrogance found itself uncelebrated. Uncelebrated hungers grow confused. Behind the Eater, the seam trembled, held open by dawn's gold and the deep's patience. From that doorway emerged three of the beings the Eater had met in the meadow. The lantern-bearer with a lamp that deepened not distance but honesty. The archivist of first times carrying a ledger in which beginnings agreed to be humble. And the weaver trailing a comet thread humming lullabies. They did not bring soldiers. They brought tempo. "Old hunger," said the lantern-bearer, lifting their light. "Behold a glow that does not flatter you." The glow deepened. The pressure, unpraised, lost posture. "Old hunger," said the archivist, opening the ledger. "Remember that even you began once, and beginning is permission to end." The ledger's pages turned of their own accord until they reached the first page. Blank. The pressure examined its face there and found it uninteresting. "Old hunger," said the weaver, tying a knot that sang, "Rest." The knot did not bind. It invited. A part of the pressure considered being tired and found the thought luxurious. But arrogance is a many-headed persistence. From its flanks, smaller hungers darted toward the nearest galaxy, tasting for panic. The Eater gathered unlight and threw it like a fisher casts a net. Not to trap, to measure. The net measured the hunger and found it smaller than attention. It shrank accordingly. The small hungers blinked, confused again, and drifted toward the ring, where the lanterns taught them the art of sitting. Still, a central column of pressure drove forward, older than the smaller appetites, proud of its staying. It had names in older tongues, famine taking always names that had once ruled rooms. It reached toward the seam as if to close it for good. The eater stepped into its path and raised the bowl. The bowl held nothing. The bowl held room. "You cannot starve room," the eater said, and the sentence steadied the corridor like a beam placed where a roof had sagged. The pressure hit the emptiness and lost track of itself. Where there is no wall, impact is confused. Where there is welcome, force has to learn grammar. The bowl did not budge. It widened. Around its rim appeared scenes, tiny as beadwork, of worlds practicing ends well. Harvest festivals where fields are thanked by being left fallow, funerals that return names to rivers, candles snuffed by breath that counts the living. The pressure gazed and could not metabolize any of it. It had not been taught to eat gratitude. On the cliff below, the bowl the eater had given to the mapmaker filled with reflected sky. The apprentice poured to the sea and said, "For the courage we will need." The sea agreed in the only way honest water can. It returned as mist. In the town the mist touched faces, and many remembered old courtesies. Doors became easier to open from both sides. The far black hesitated. Some of its mass peeled off and drifted toward the seam in curiosity. Curiosity is mercy's spy. It went ahead, reported back, and found there were chairs inside the door. Chairs are betrayal to tyrannies. They suggest endings can be sat with rather than conquered. "Who are you?" the pressure asked at last, not roaring, asking. "I am the room where you can stop," said the Star Eater. "I do not take your name. I take your pace." "How?" "By attention," said the Eater, as it had told tedium in the void. "Attention is the eldest sibling of love." The pressure tried one last strategy. It tried to become everything. It swelled, diffusing toward ubiquity, a blanket that meant to smother gratitude's particularities. The lantern ring did not fight. It specialized. Each flame chose a story and told it without sound. A midwife's hands, a soldier laying down a spear to pick up a broom, a baker counting 12 loaves and deciding the 13th belongs to whoever is late. Specificity is a solvent for abstractions that pretend to be destiny. The swelling faltered. Then, as if embarrassed by its own size, the pressure contracted. It became something that could sit. The eater gestured. It sat on nothing like kings learn to when the throne is taken away. Around it, the lanterns dimmed to a listening glow. "What becomes of me?" the pressure asked, voice no longer older than pity. "You become appetite with manners," said the eater. "You become harvest that leaves seed. You become hunger that makes room at tables." It lifted one lantern and placed it in the pressure's hands. "You become needed." Needed. The word taught the pressure a posture. It unlearned 1,000 insistences in one long exhale. Where it had begun to threaten galaxies, it now turned, almost shy, and faced the seam. "May I cross?" it asked the first dawn. "Only if you are willing to rest," said Dawn, who had never despised hunger, only its noise. The pressure nodded and passed into the meadow. The archivist made a note. The weaver tied a lullaby to its back so it would remember to sleep. The lantern-bearer shaded a corner for it to consider particular joys. The seam quieted. The eater lowered the bowl. Across space, stars resumed their honest work. In the town below, people looked up for no reason and smiled because the horizon had exhaled. The mapmaker and the apprentice sat on the stool and the stone, the lantern between them. "Is it over?" the apprentice asked. "Not over," said the mapmaker. "But we have learned how to end, how to keep room," she answered, and dipped her fingers in the bowl's remaining water, touching the map where the coast still argued with the sea. The ink darkened with gratitude. The Star Eater descended. It stood beside them and watched the apprentice draw a new symbol on the margin, a small ring of flames around an empty circle. "What will you call it?" the eater asked. "The table," said the apprentice, surprising themselves. "A place for hungers to become guests." The eater smiled with its whole weather. "Good." It looked toward the seam where dawn waited with chairs and the deep held the hinge steady. "There is one more lesson," it said to both humans. "You will teach it." "What lesson?" "That every crossing is twofold," the eater replied. "Light must learn to kneel. Shadow must learn to stand." The apprentice frowned, then laughed. The expression felt like a door that had decided to be a window too. "We can try." "Try well," said the eater, remembering the child with the kite in another story, another world. It lifted, carrying the ring of lanterns in its chest like a heartbeat visible to those who needed it. From the seam, the first dawn spoke softly, a promise heard by rooms rather than ears. "Shadow, after the next tide we will ask a final thing, a joining not of thrones, of tasks." "I am ready," said the Star Eater. It looked once more at the blue world, the chairs, the bowl, the ring drawn on the map, and kept that ordinary courage like a talisman. Then it turned and began the long, patient arc back to the door where endings and beginnings sit at the same table and learn each other's spoons. The universe had grown quiet enough to hear its own breathing. Galaxies turned with unhurried dignity, the deep hummed content beneath the weave, and the seam between light and unlight stood open like a door that trusted its hinges. The first dawn waited beside it, robes of brightness gathered, a chair prepared beside the threshold. Across the vastness, the Star Eater approached, its braid of shadow and dawn pulsing like a calm heart. "You are late," said Dawn with a smile that knew patience as devotion. "I was listening," said the Eater. "The blue world told a story about hunger learning manners. I stayed until the story thanked itself." "That is how legends should end," said Dawn. "With gratitude." They stood together at the seam. Beyond lay both the meadow of beginnings and the corridors of unlight. Behind them, the world spun like beads on a thread too long for counting. "It is time," said the deep, its voice a pressure that sounded like blessing. "We must decide what keeps balance when keeping alone is not enough." The Eater turned to Dawn. "We have been guardians from opposite sides. Shadow shaping silence, light tending birth. But the work is one labor. 2 hands, 1 bowl." "Then let us join," said the first dawn. It lifted its palms, and from each streamed gold. The Eater opened its hands, and from them flowed the tender dark that remembers use. Where they met, a new seam formed, neither night nor morning, but an hour made of both. The deep breathed, and across the cosmos, tides shifted, a rhythm born that day and dusk could share. Stars pulsed in pairs. Light and pause, sound and listening. Even the voids between them felt wider, generous. So this is what bridge means, the Eater murmured. Not path, but pulse. Not ending, Dawn answered, but breath. Together they stepped through the new seam. Inside, the meadow and the unlight mingled into a vast room lined with chairs, millions, billions, enough for every name creation had ever spoken. On each seat burned a small flame, some bright, some dim, all steady. "What are these?" asked the Eater. "Memories that learned gentleness," said Dawn. "Every grief that chose to teach rather than wound." The Eater touched one and felt in it the echo of the river child's laughter, the mapmaker's ink, the apprentice's quiet resolve. They remembered. It whispered. "Because you did," said Dawn. "You gave endings a place to rest. They repaid you with stories that do not devour." The deep spoke again. "The weave holds, but now comes choice. Will you stay here, keeping both sides? Or will you walk among the worlds as balance itself?" The Eater looked at its lanterns, now soft silver embers, and at the seam stretching infinite. "If I stay, balance will depend on presence. If I walk, it will depend on memory. Memory travels farther." "Then walk," said Dawn, placing a hand on its shoulder. "But know this, you are no longer the shadow of fear. You are the keeper of turns." The Eater bowed, the gesture both farewell and promise. It took a single lantern from its chest, the first it ever lit in the meadow, and gave it to Dawn. "For beginnings." Dawn smiled and handed back a thread of light wound through shadow. "For endings." They sealed the exchange with silence, the oldest blessing. The Star Eater stepped away, through galaxies that shone not from arrogance but participation. Everywhere it went, people began to notice gentler pauses. Rivers remembering when to rest, hearts learning not to mistake stillness for absence. A teacher in a far world told her students, "Even stars breathe out between songs." And the children nodded as if they'd always known. On the blue world, the mapmaker grew old. The apprentice, now master, kept the lantern by the sea. When travelers asked what it was, they said, "A reminder that darkness is where light rehearses." Some nights, when storms came, the lantern's glow reached far across the waves. Sailors swore they saw a figure walking there, tall, veiled, carrying a bowl that caught lightning like water. They called it the Keeper of Turns. The Star Eater continued its rounds, not as warden but as witness. It sang softly in the spaces between suns, teaching them patience, reminding them they did not shine alone. Each dawn was slower, kinder. Each dusk lingered long enough for gratitude. And one evening, when even the deep seemed to rest, the Eater paused. It looked back across the weave and saw no seams, only threads that trusted one another. The ache in its chest pulsed once, content. It had become what it had always been becoming. Not hunger, not shadow harbor. It turned toward the unseen and whispered the only prayer it knew. "Thank you for the room." Then it crossed again into the quiet where all stories exhale, where endings and beginnings meet without rivalry, and where every listener, for a heartbeat, becomes the dream they came to hear. Thank you for listening to Sleep with Myth.